Hello, fifth grade. So we have finished chapter 8, like the book and the readings and the lessons about it. But I wanted to do just a few little extension activities as we talk about slavery in the Americas and really looking at a few things that I've perused and found. As you guys know, I love history. And I love what we learn from history and the fact that things are documented for us to remember and to learn from and to better ourselves. So, what I found or what I knew about, because I know about so many things, is in the 1930s, there was a federal project called the Federal Writers Project, and their job was to help document things that had happened at the turn of the century, after the Civil War. And what was happening is so many of the people who had lived through the Civil War and through that time period were starting to die off and were passing away. And there was this piece of history that needed to be documented and saved. You had the Library of Congress that really went to start to document all these federal documents. And in doing so, one section of the Federal Writers Project, there was this huge project during this time period to try to savor the things that happened pre the 1800s. Was this idea of there were still people alive or who were starting to pass away who were born into slavery, who had lived through slavery in the 1800s, lived through emancipation and the Civil War, and life post Civil War, and a life in which, yes, they were free, but they were still being oppressed. And this idea of remembering those stories and capturing it. There were physical evidence they found. So it's called, if you ever want to peruse it instead of finding silly things on YouTube to look at, it's called the Library of Congress, or you could just even Google Federal Writers Project and it'll totally pop up. This piece right here is called The Slave Narratives Born into Slavery, and it's part of their collection, but they have other collections. Like they had a whole thing on Lincoln. I spent almost a whole day just looking through it. My favorite president, but they had all of his speeches, and they have, the amazing of technologies. You can see these images. Their letters, their draftings. So the Slave Narratives is a collection of stories and interviews that were documented in transcript of interviews with slaves, post slaves, obviously, and some of them were written down. Now we have to keep in mind this were people who were born in the 1800s. Lived an incredibly hard life, lived past the Civil War. So they survived the Civil War. So they lived through so many events through history. So most were not educated, couldn't read and write. So all of these are transcribed, which means they're having an oral interview with someone who's asking them questions, like a bunch of topics. And so some of the interview that I'm going to share with you is one narrative of an ex-person who lived through slavery, which was Sarah Gruder, and it's a story of her life. Now, granted, it is read by someone else, but the transcript is part of the slaves' narrative collection on the Library of Congress. So I had found the narrative on YouTube, and then I was like, oh, well, I know about the slave narratives on the Federal Writer Project. So I searched through the Library of Congress, and because I have great research skills, I was able to find her transcript through the whole collection, which was, it's gonna be wild, but I found it. So her transcript was typed up, and then they found this woman recorded the reading of the transcript. Okay, so we are going to read through it, and what you are going to do, because it's hard not to just, I don't want to just answer silly questions about her experiences. I would really just like you to listen to the narrative. I'm going to pause it during certain sections and kind of explain it, because obviously, she wasn't educated, and the reading is the actual transcript of her. It's kind of hard to understand what her experiences were, and some things you'll be able to understand easily what she talks about, some things she's weren't. And also the dialect that they've spoken from the South, and then also not maybe being uneducated is very different, right? Like we say you all, right? And they say y'all, right? So those kind of like little colloquialisms that we call them of people. So I'm going to pause it a few times, just kind of let you know what was said. But then what I want you to do is on your slides or on your document, just put like some bullet points and just put your thoughts down. Pause the video. What are you thinking? Or summarize, like, what's something that you just heard about her life that I think there's something amazing to be said about someone and the power of people to live through this experience, and the fact that it's documented. what a beautiful life and person to be able to speak on that. Not a beautiful life, but life post, I hope. So something about it was very touching. It's very moving to read and um, learn from. So I'm going to stop my video here and I will move to the audio. And then while the audio is playing, I am going to be showing the manuscript piece. Okay, so just give me 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to play her narrative. And then while it's playing, I will be showing the narrative on the screen here.
I was born about 2 miles from Old Fort on the old Morganton Road. I just had a hard life. Just work and work and work. I'd never known nothing but work. My boss, he was the old man Andy Hemphill. He had a large plantation in the valley. Plenty of everything. All kind of stock. Hogs, cows, mules, and horses. When Marse Andy died, I go live with his son, William Hemphill. I never forget when Marse Andy died. He was a good old man, and the missus, she was good too. She used to read the Bible to us children before she passed away.
So, real quick, just to kind of go over, um, she says she lived a hard life. So, this is Sarah Gudger, born September 15th, 1816. And this interview was in 1937. Let's do a little subtraction, figure out how old she's there. And so, what she says, she's lived on a large plantation, and her boss was the old man, Andy Hemphill. And they had livestock. And when the master Andy died, I went to go live with his son William Hemphill. So when the owner of our plantation passed away, their slaves went to their next in kin, so their children, or they were sold off. So saying that her master was a good man, and that the wife, the missus, that's the missus, the master's wife, was also good and read the Bible to the children. All right, so I'm going to keep on.
My pappy, he lived with Joe Gudger. He old and feeble, I remembers. He depend on my pappy to see after everything for him. He always trust my pappy. One morning he followed pappy to the field. Pappy he stopped his work and old Marsh Joe he say, "Well, Smart?" Pappy he named Smart. "I's tired, worried, and troubled. All these years I work for my children. They never do the right thing. They worries me, Smart. I tell you, Smart, I's a good mind to put myself away. I's a good mind to drown myself right here. I's terrible worried, Smart." Pappy he take hold of Marsh Joe and lead him to the house. "Now, Marsh Joe, I wouldn't talk such talk if I was you. You been good to your family. Just you content yourself and rest." But a few days after that, old Marsh Joe was found a hanging in the barn by the bridle. Old Marsh had put himself away.
So what she says is that her father was a trusted worker for the owner, the master, and was very old, and at the end of his life took his own life, um, and then after that they were sent away.
No, I never know what it was to rest. I just work all the time from morning till late at night. I had to do everything they wanted to do on the outside. Work in the field, chop wood, hoe corn, till sometimes I feel like my back surely break. I done everything except split rails. You know they split rails back in them days. Well, I never did split no rails. Old Marsh strop us good if and we did anything he didn't like. Sometime he'd get his dander up and then we dancing look round at him. Else he tie your hands for your body and whip you just like you a mule. Lordy, honey, I stuck 1,000 lashings in my day. Sometimes my poor old body be so for a week.
So what she's saying is she's known nothing in her life except working all day, all night, All she ever did was work on the outside. She worked in the fields, and all the tasks she did in the fields. And that when they didn't do anything good, they would get whipped or lashed. Pretty much lashings mean whipped. Um, and how she remembers being sore for weeks after receiving lashings.
Oh, boss, he send us niggers out there in any kind of weather. Rain or snow, it never matter. We had to go to the mountains, cut wood, and drag it down to the house. Many a time we come in with our clothes stuck to our poor cold bodies, but 'twa'n't no use to try to get 'em dry. If the old boss or the old missy see us, they yell, "Get on out of here, yo black thing, and get your work out of the way." And Lordy, honey, we know to get, else we get the lash. They didn't care how old or how young you was, you never too big to get the lash.
So, real quick, obviously, some terms that they refer to themselves as were how they were called upon. Obviously, the N word is completely not even a word, probably worse than a curse word. But you have to keep in mind that she is born into slavery. That is a term they call her, and other terms, little black thing. And obviously, we think of those, that sounds so horrible, but that's part of, listening to this narrative and understanding the concept of how they were talked to and how, they eventually talked to themselves like that because that was what they knew.
The rich white folk never did no work. They had darkies to do it for them. In the summer, we had to work outdoors, in the winter in the house. I had to card and spin till 10 o'clock. Never get much rest. And to get up at 4 the next morning and start again. Didn't get much to eat neither. Just a little cornbread and lasses. Lordy, honey, y'all can't know what a time I had. All cold and hungry. No, I ain't telling no lies. It's the gospel truth. Sure is.
So I think that one's pretty easy to kind of understand, right? All she's saying that the rich white people never did any work. They had slaves. Obviously they were called darkies. That's kind of what that means. So they had slaves to do all their work. Worked until 10 o'clock at night. Barely had time to rest. Woke up at 4 in the morning. Barely got any food. So cornbread, and this is like molasses. So if you don't know what molasses is, it's like a dark syrup. It's not like a corn syrup, but it's a primary product. It's used in a lot of things. Um, and obviously, no rest for the weary.
I remember well how I used to lie awake till all the folks were sleeping, then creep out in the door and walk barefoot in the snow about 2 mile to my old auntie's house. I knowed when I get there she fix hot corn pone with slice of meat and some milk for me to eat. Auntie was good to us darkies.
So real quick, she's saying that she would wait till everyone was asleep, and then she would go in the middle of the night and walk 2 miles, sometimes in the snow, to her auntie's house. Now, it could have been biological auntie or a kind woman that took care of her, also like a motherly figure. Obviously, the term auntie could also is a reference for just someone endearing. So, but yeah, that's where she would get a decent meal to eat with a slice of meat, milk.
I never sleep on a bedstead till after freedom. No, till after freedom. Just an old pile of rags in the corner. Hardly enough to keep us from freezing. Oh, Lord, child. Nobody knows how mean darkies was treated. Well, they was better to the animals than to us. And my first old moss was a good old man, but the last one, he was rabid. He sure was rabid. My child, times ain't no more like they used to be than the day and night am like. In my day and time, all the folks worked. If they had no niggers, they worked themselves. If the children was too small to hold, they pulled weeds. Now the big bottom of the Swananoa, that used to grow hundreds bushel of green in just a playground. I like to see the children in the field. Why now they fight you like wildcat if it ever been talked about. That's the reason time's so hard. No farming. Why, I can remember old Missy, she say, this generation will pass away and a new generation will come along. That's just it. Every generation gets weaker and weaker. Then they talk about going back to old times. That time done gone. They never meet that time again.
So real quick, she talks about never have slept in a bed until after freedom. So born in 1816, slaves were emancipated in 1863, let's say 1865. In Texas, it was at least in 1865. And this was written in 1963, if I'm not mistaken. Or I'm sorry, God, 1938. My gosh, I can't put two numbers together. And so what she's talking about is the idea of she's only slept in rags in the corner until after she was free. She actually had a bed to sleep in. And just I think this piece right here is really just talking about children and the jobs that children did and the life of working and how, living on the farm, they always had jobs to do. Everyone always had something to do.
Wasn't none of the slaves off on our plantation ever sold, but the ones on the other plantation of Moss Williams was. Oh, that was a terrible time. All the slaves be in the field, plowing, hoeing, singing in the boiling sun. Old Moss, he come through the field with a man called the speculator. They walk around just looking, just looking.
So real quick, what she was saying is that on the plantation that she lived on, no one was ever sold, but the other person's plantation, they knew of people who were sold. And they were worked hard, right? Singing in the having to sing in the sun, right? They were sometimes they're also forced to sing and have their work while they had to do the work. And she calls it a speculator. It's like it's. I mean, we would think of it as a land spectator or someone who would evaluate a land, but during this time in the early to mid 1800s, they were like slave traders. So they call it speculator, but I want to say spectator would come. A land speculator would come and they would evaluate the slaves while they were working, right? Just walking around, watching them, and then they would trade and use it as a way to move slaves around different plantations.
All the darkies know what this means. They didn't dare look up, just work right on. Then the speculator, he see who he want. He talked on Moss, then he slaps the handcuffs on him, tack him away to the cotton country. Oh, them was awful times. When the speculator was ready to go with the slaves, if there was any who didn't want to go, he thrash 'em, then tie 'em behind the wagon and make 'em run till they fall on the ground. Then he thrash 'em till they say they go without no trouble. Sometimes some of them run away and come back to the plantation. Then it was harder on them than before. When the darkies went to dinner, the old nigger mammy, she say, why I'm such and such. None of the others want to tell her. But when she see them look down to the ground, she just say, the speculator, the speculator. Then the tears roll down her cheeks. 'Cause maybe her son or husband, and she know she never see him again. Maybe they leaves babies to home. Maybe just pappy and mammy. Oh, my lordy. My old boss was mean, but he never sent us to the cotton country.
All right. So there's a lot that's really in here. It's you know, that when the as she calls it, the speculator, the slave trader would come, or slave trader, spectator would come, they would, find the slave one, and they would be going down to cotton country. So She was in North Carolina. So, and on her farm, she says they didn't have cotton. So, what she's saying is that the cotton, having to work in the fields for and pick cotton, was much harder of a life than the hard life that she had lived, and that was something they never wanted to do. So even though she was never traded and they never had to work in cotton country, that was like the worst of the worst that they could work. And if they refused to go, they would thrash them, right? So whip them. They would tie them behind the wagon and make them run, so following the wagon. And when they fell on the ground, then they'd whip them again until they would go without any problems. If slaves ran away, they would come back to the plantation and they would have a harder time than they did before, obviously, if they were being punished. Um, and she says they have a mammy. And I mean, what they mean is, I think, someone that looks over some of the other slaves in the area in the quarters where they lived. Um, and what I think, which is interesting, says, maybe they would leave a child at the house, but they would take the mom and the dad. So talking about how families were split up, or they would take the son or the husband, and they would never see them again. And this idea here where I'd never seen us, they never send us to cotton country. So going to cotton country was worse than living the life and doing the work that they had to do.
There was very few schools back in the day and time, very few. We darkies didn't dare look at no book, not even to pick it up. Old Missy, that is my first old Missy, she was a good old woman. She read to the niggers and to the white children. She come from across the water. She wasn't like the smart white folks living here now. When she come over here, she brung Darky Boy with her. He was her personal servant. 'Cause they got different names for him now, but in that day they calls them Guinea niggers. She was a good old woman, not like other white folks. Niggers like old Missy.
So comparing her mistresses, saying that, obviously they didn't have any schools, but if they were to be read to, it was from the master's wife, or the plantation, the wife of the field. And interesting, the one who was kind to her, if you picked up on this, she comes from across the waters, right? So obviously she comes from Europe. She's not from she's not the white people who are already living there now. So very interesting, the southern white people who live there being crueler versus those who were coming maybe from Europe and were kinder to people. And then that this one had a servant boy with her, obviously with terms that I'm not going to repeat or read.
The darkies get sick. They was put in a little old house close to the big house, and one of the other darkies waited on them. There was very few doctors then, only 3 in the whole section. When they wanted medicine, they went to the woods and gathered horehound, slippery elm for poultices, and all kind of bark for teas. All these jobs bring you round. There was very few lawyers then too, but laws of me, you can't turn around for them now.
So what she's saying is that when they got sick, they had to go into a separate house, and that another slave was then to care for a slave that was sick, and they didn't have any medicine, so they would find, get barks from and leaves from plants and make teas, and that's how they would get themselves better.
I remembers when my old mammy died. She lived on Williams Creek with the other Hempels. She sick long time. One day, white man come to see me. He say, "Sarah, do you know your mammy was dead?" "No," I say, "but I wants to see my mother 'fore they puts her away." I went to the house and said to old Missy, "My mother, she died today. I wants to see my mother 'fore they puts her away." But she look at me mean and say, "Get on out of here and get back to your work, for I'll wallop you good." So I went back to my work with the tears streaming down my face, just a ring in my hands. I wanted to see my mammy so. 'Bout 2 weeks later, old Missy, she get terrible sick. She just linger long for a long time, but she never gets up no more. Wasn't long before they puts her away too, just like my mammy.
Sophie, that I think was pretty clearly to be understood that her mother passed away and she asked for permission to go see her mother before they buried her. And the master's wife, the missus, didn't allow her to go or threatened to beat her. So, but then the master's wife got sick, was unable to move, so was bedridden, and then eventually passed away as well.
I remembers the time when my mammy was alive. I was a small child 'fore they took to Rims Creek. All us children was playing in the yard one night, just running and playing like children will. All of a sudden, Mammy come to the door all excited. "Come in here this minute," she say. "Just look up at what's a-happening." And bless your life, honey, the stars was falling just like rain. Mammy was terrible scared, but we children wasn't afeard, no. We were.
So, real quick, another piece to say is that before they took her to Rims Creek, so where she says here that her mother had passed away, she lived on Rims Creek with the other Hemphills. So that was a son. So the mother was probably sent to live with the other family, and she lived with still the master and probably with the father. So obviously they separated the family. So she was asking permission to go to the other plantation to see her mom. And so interesting here, they said one of the most spectacular meteoric showers on record was visible all over North America, occurred in 1833. So in 1833, she saw this meteor shower and it scared her mother. Obviously, they have no education, so they had no idea of what a meteor shower was. So they see it as the sky falling.
But Mammy, she say every time a star falls, somebody gonna die. Look like a lot of folks gonna die from the looks of them stars. Everything was just as bright as day. You could have picked a pin up. You know the stars don't shine as bright as they did back then. I wonder why they don't. They just don't shine as bright. Wasn't long before they took my mammy away. I was left alone. On the plantation was an old woman what the boss bought from a drover up in Virginia. The boss, he bought her from one of the speculators. She laugh and tell us, "Some of these days y'all going to be free, just like the white folks." But we all laugh at her. No, we just slaves. We always have to work and never be free. Then when freedom come, she say, "I told y'all. Now you got no learning, you got no nothing, got no home. What you going to do? Didn't I tell you?"
So they brought someone else up from Virginia, that's Virginia. And she's telling the other slaves that, and she was traded from the speculators, right? They call them the speculators, that they were going to be free soon, right? So this is kind of working towards emancipation. And when they did become free, this woman comes back and says, you know, what do you have? You have no learning, you have nothing, you have no home. What are you gonna do, right? Which was kind of this problem of what happens to those who are emancipated. What happens to them because they have no land, they have no money, they have barely any rights except they're no longer owned by their plantation owner.
I was getting along smartly in years when the war come. I remember just like yesterday, just before the war, Moss William was a-talking to his brother. I was standing off a piece. Moss' brother, he say, "William, how old and say now?" Moss William look at me and he say, "She getting nigh on to 50. That was just a little while before the war. That was awful time. Us darkies didn't know what it was all about. Only one of the boys from the plantation go. He Alexander. He about 25 then. Many the time we get word the Yankees coming. We take our food and stock and hide it till we show they's gone. We wasn't bothered much. One day, I never forget it, we look out and see soldiers marching. Looked like the whole valley full of them. I thought, poor helpless critters, just going away to get killed. The drums was beating and the fifes a playing. There was the foot company. Oh, glory, it was a sight. Sometime they come home on furlough. Sometime they get killed before they gets through. Alexander, he come home a few times before freedom. When the war was over, Moss William, he say, do y'all know y'all's free? You free now. I chuckle, remembering what old woman tell us about freedom and no larning. A lot of men want me to go to foreign land, but I tell 'em I go live with my pappy, long as he live. I stay with the white folks about 12 months, then I stay with my pappy, long as he live. I had 2 brothers. They went to California. Never see them no more. Nor my sister, neither. I can't remember such a lot about it all. I just knows I's born and bred here in these parts. Never been out in it. I's well. Never take no doctor medicine. Just been sick once. That after freedom.
So the end of that ends with her talking about seeing, the soldiers come out during the Civil War, and the slave that left to go fight, he comes a couple times before freedom. Furloughs when they had their time off in between their service. Um, and then the master, Williams, tells him that she's freed and no, she doesn't know what to do. So she stays with them and continued to work with them for a year, technically. Then she goes to live with her brothers or her father while he was alive. Then she continues to just stay in the land because she had nothing else, nowhere else to go. And that's all she knew was the land where she lived. And she was never sick. And she was only sick once, and that was after freedom. So the entire time, and even before the war, they said she was 50 years old. So 50 years and it was never sick and just worked her entire life. So if I'm not mistaken, I think that is the end of it. Yeah, the next one is the next document. Is the next document for the next person. So actually, I forgot to check what. Sorry, I'm trying to find. Okay, so wow, look at this. So it says ex-slave, 121 years. Investigation of almost incredible claim of Aunt Sarah Grunder, ex-slave living in Asheville, that she was born on September 15th, 1816, discloses some factual information corroborating her statements, meaning things that she had said happened and that she witnessed happen. Aunt Sarah's father, Smart Grunder, belonged to and took his family's name from Joe Grunder, who lived near Oaton, about, I should zoom in, 6 miles east of Asheville in the Sawana Valley prior to the war between the states. Family records show that Joe Grunder married Miss McRae in 1817, and that while in despondent, he ended his own life by hanging himself, and vividly recounted by the former slave. So the master took his own life. John Hemphill, member of the family, served by Aunt Sarah until freedom, is recalled as being a few years younger as me, and indeed his birth is record for 1822. So she was a little bit older than the person she went to go work for. Alexander Hemphill, mentioned by Aunt Sarah as having left to join the Confederate Army when... Oh, it was the son, not the ex-slave. Sorry, that was Alexander. I didn't miss that part. About 25 years of age, is authentic, and his approximate age in 1861 tallies that recalled by ex-slaves. And Sarah lives with distant cousins in a 2-story frame house, comfortably furnished, in South Asheville, in a section north of kennel for so black, like a, I mean, they use the N word, but really it's a black section, which we'll talk about next, of why post slavery where they were allowed to live. A distant male relative, 72 years of age, said he has known Aunt Sarah all his life and that she was an old woman when he was a small boy. She lived a very long life. Wow. Small in stature, about 5 feet tall, Aunt Sarah is rather round in face and body. Milk chocolate face is, so that is her photo. Surrounded by sparse hair, almost milk white. She is somewhat deaf but understands questions asked to her, responding with animation. She walks with one crutch, being lame in her right leg. So her right leg doesn't work. On the events of the long ago, her mind is quite clear, recalling the Confederate soldiers marching to the drums. She beats to a tempo on the floor with her crutch, and she describes how the hands of slaves were tied before they were whipped for infractions. She crossed her wrists. Um, let's see what else it says. So then they just talk about other people who have known her and their early associations with her. And it says the interview by a member of the Federal Writers Project, Aunt Sarah seemed eager to talk and needed little prompting, meaning she didn't need to talk about her life, or she didn't have to be asked questions. She actually kind of talked freely on her life. It's pretty amazing. So if you want to go into your document, write a few bullet points, just your thoughts, different pieces that maybe we were picked up on, and your thoughts about them. Just a reflection about, obviously this was post Civil War, this narrative, and obviously we're talking, when we think of talking about slavery in our history, we're talking about American history during the American Revolution and the creating of America, but still nonetheless very important to see the life and people who are able to continue to live for a purpose.